Is cryptocurrency actually currency, or is it something which is virtual?
The question of cryptocurrencies is one that has a range of answers. But if you ask me, is it currency? It is currency. It is currency to the extent that anything can be a currency so long as it is a medium of exchange and a store of value. It can be considered some kind of currency, some kind of tender.
Those countries which view cryptocurrencies with concern and are reluctant to legalize it, what is their dominant concern basically?
Their dominant concern is twofold. Their ability to manage their economy weakens if people are using something alternate to bypass, to siphon, or to remit money in new ways.
Do you think cryptocurrencies will erode state control and monopoly over monetary policy?
They certainly will. Many governments were initially terrified by the idea of cryptocurrency, and some even promised the idea of having their own cryptocurrency, a central bank digital currency.
What sort of disadvantages can you identify that investing and facilitating cryptocurrencies could perhaps result into?
Many countries are very desperate to protect the value of their own currencies and actually do a lot of gimmickry to protect it.
How do you see the public interest or state concern in Pakistan towards cryptocurrencies?
When you hear comments about cryptocurrency, you hear them in an ad hoc manner. Previous politicians, a few, have said that we're going to ban this immediately, which doesn't make sense, because if you want to do that, you better have a strong rupee. You have to give your people some reasonable alternatives, otherwise they will find their own ways to survive.
Viewers, very warm welcome to another episode of V News English program Perspectives, in which we bring very informed and insightful perspectives on some of the very critical issues that the world faces today. So today we are about to discuss a very interesting and fast emerging issue of cryptocurrencies. There's a lot of misperception and confusion regarding cryptocurrencies, whether they are lawful, whether they're illegal, whether it is black money, or some countries consider it illegal, some countries facilitate it. What is the politics behind it, and what are the emerging trends, and what can we learn about it, and should we invest in it or not? So in order to discuss these issues, we are joined today by one of the leading experts on cryptocurrencies in particular, but one of the leading experts of economics in Pakistan, Dr. Usman Chohan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Dr. Usman has a very illustrious and distinguished career. He did his PhD from Australia in economics, but more relevant are his several books and publications related to blockchain, blockchain scarcity and value, a history of Bitcoin, the decentralized autonomous organizations and governance issues, the double spending problem and cryptocurrencies, and several others. So I think perhaps in Pakistan he's the leading expert on cryptocurrencies. So first off, Dr. Chohan, tell us, is cryptocurrency actually currency, or is it something which is virtual?
First of all, thank you for having me on the show. We have a long-standing friendship, so it's nice to catch up with you. The question of cryptocurrencies is one that has a range of answers. But if you ask me, is it currency? It is currency. It is currency to the extent that anything can be a currency so long as it is a medium of exchange and a store of value. So can Bitcoin be exchanged today, for example? It can, and there are mechanisms to do this online. Is it a store of value? People argue about this because it is quite volatile. But so are currencies these days, fiat currencies. The stock market is so volatile. Because we live in an age of turbulence, broadly speaking, the legitimization of cryptocurrency in many people's minds has grown. In addition, cryptocurrency isn't quite as new as we think because the original white paper came out in 2008. And now we are in 2024. So we are close to 2 decades from the origination of this. There has been a significant adoption. And so long as that adoption grows and people hold on to it and use it for certain purposes, it can be considered some kind of currency, some kind of tender. And in addition, as you correctly mentioned, there are some countries that facilitate it. And in one or two, it is equivalent to a legal tender, equivalent to their own currency now. And you may see a greater adoption in this regard.
I would like your brief take on how does the world politics affect the cryptocurrencies, the issue of sovereign currency, the issue of sovereignty in a nation state. A currency is seen as a symbol of financial sovereignty of a country. But is it true for cryptocurrencies as well?
You've raised a fascinating question because most nation states, and you know, nation states are maximum a 300-year-old idea. The fact that we have had 300 years of nation states, we have seen currencies rise and fall. At some points, nations don't have their own currencies. They may dollarize. The United States itself, during the 13 colonies, had 13 currencies. So the association of the sovereignty with the paper money is quite new. There was a time when you had gold as a thing, and then it made sense because the imprimatur of the king would go on it. His face was on that. Therefore, he exercised sovereignty, and he could do seigniorage, so diluting the quantity of gold through silver or anything else.
We have seen a new issuance of pound in which you have,
Yes.
the face of King Charles imprinted on it, replacing Queen Elizabeth II.
That's correct. So once they have their face on that, it gives that monetary authority and sovereignty. But cryptocurrencies come from a different logic because they believe that the people are sovereign. And that is the populist mindset. And it emerged in a particular time in capitalism, which was the 2008 financial crisis, which you remember vividly. I do. I started my career at that time in finance, and people were very disenchanted with it. The idea that you have sovereign powers exercising authority through money supply is only legitimate so long as you trust their aptitude and their competence to do it. But if countries go around printing money, they generate inflation, they start wars, frivolous wars at times, and then they use this instrument as economic sanctions or weaponizing their currency. These are all phenomena that we've seen in the last decade.
Indeed.
And so because of this, people are not so tied to the idea of a king wearing a crown, stamping a coin anymore. You can have this done in a digital way where the importance is that you and I can do an exchange and we don't even need to know each other to do it. That's the beauty of cryptocurrencies.
But I think your very insightful perspective makes me wonder that if cryptocurrency essentially represent people's currency, does that not indirectly tantamount to reducing the state control over the supply of money and, for that matter, the monetary policy? Do you think cryptocurrencies will erode state control and monopoly over monetary policy?
They certainly will. And you're absolutely right to raise this point, because if people start to switch to other forms of exchange in lieu of the sovereign currencies, the fiat currencies, where fiat means be, and it is kun fayakun type idea. So if they start to use things in alternation to that, yes, you will have a much weaker monetary authority. And that's why many governments were initially terrified by the idea of cryptocurrency, and some even promised the idea of having their own cryptocurrency, a central bank digital currency. Those have been piloted, trying to bridge the gap between the people's views and the sovereign's power, but they haven't caught on very much because ultimately they are offering a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Either people are sovereign or the king is sovereign, and that's really what it boils down to.
So let's come to, clearly defining and dividing the world between nation states which allow and consider cryptocurrency as lawful tender and those which don't. I mean, how many countries do you think recognize or facilitate cryptocurrencies, and how many do you think consider it illegal?
In a recent paper of mine, I built a spectrum out where I looked at the level of comfort that authorities have with cryptocurrencies. And you see a spectrum. There's about 7 different degrees from absolute outright hostility to complete openness. On either side, they're comparatively small economies. Major economies tend to fall somewhere in the middle, with perhaps one exception, which is usually the exception, which is China. China has banned cryptocurrency, so you can't deal with that stuff. But initially, there was a lot of interest in mainland China for this. Otherwise, most countries fall somewhere in the middle. You have countries like the United States, which have tolerated it. Canada, Australia, these countries fall in the toleration, but they also have very competent financial authorities with tough oversight, and they can execute a lot of power through the financial system. So they have been carefully observing it and are working towards rules. As we speak today, the price of Bitcoin is at its highest ever, at $94,000.
Indeed.
And that is because Donald Trump is sympathetic to the cryptocurrency lobby. They have actually gotten together. Major exchanges and other agencies that deal with cryptocurrencies have gotten together and exercised political power at the primaries level and that sort of thing. So Trump's main point to them was, we will have rules for this, but we will sit with you and we'll work out the rules. And that is the kind of endorsement that this community needed. When you look at developing countries, there are some that are extremely favorable at this. For example, there's a country called El Salvador, which has recently achieved economic peace and social peace. And so it wants to become the, quote, Singapore of Central America. They are pushing it equivalent to their peso. So you can, in principle, change between peso and Bitcoin. Both would be accepted. On the other hand, you have some developing countries that are extremely hostile to it, either because they don't know it very well, or they're worried that this will become a money laundering thing. And those risks do exist. So there is some validity to a skepticism about this stuff, because it isn't all hunky-dory. You have many crises in this that are worrisome in terms of money laundering, used in terrorism, in drugs. All these things have been identified by the US Justice Department as well. And so there are nefarious actors, state and non-state, that do deploy crypto-type instruments to move money around.
So those countries which view cryptocurrencies with concern and are reluctant to legalize it, what is their dominant concern basically?
Their dominant concern is twofold, both of which you have alluded to already. The first is their ability to manage their economy weakens if people are using something alternate to bypass, to siphon, or to remit money in new ways.
So if I would to interrupt you to briefly link the monetary control of state on currency with the type of political system that certain countries have, will it be appropriate to assume that countries with a more authoritarian and centralized political system would be less keen on allowing and facilitating it?
The correlation is not one-to-one, because the most open or most sympathetic country to Bitcoin, for example, is considered an electoral autocracy. El Salvador enjoys the will of the people, but it does have autocratic bent. For example, it has undermined its Supreme Court and things like that. Although I have much appreciation for the way things have improved in that country by this leadership, it is considered an electoral autocracy. And on the same spectrum, at the very end, you have countries like Myanmar, which you can consider to be a junta brutalizing its people. So the democracy, autocracy, XY quadrant may not be the right way to look at it. It has to do with other circumstances such as the stability of currency, the amount of illegal activity, the actual exercise of the state, which can be strong in democracies or autocracies. And so the correlation, if you panned it out, may not be a strong positive or negative one.
So what sort of disadvantages can you identify that investing and facilitating cryptocurrencies could perhaps result into?
Well, some of the negatives that it would entail depends on the perspective. The state would lose monetary authority or certainly see it diminish. That's one thing. Second, their ability to track illegal activity declines. That's something that is of concern to many people. But the third is that many countries are very desperate to protect the value of their own currencies and actually do a lot of gimmickry to protect it. Maybe it's something minor like a trade surplus or trade deficit. Maybe it's something like actually manipulating the currency and not letting it float freely. freely. These types of tools are removed. And whenever a country faces an economic difficulty, a real difficulty, it often needs to resort to a monetary solution. And if it doesn't have that in its arsenal, it finds itself very weak. For example, Greece, after 2012, did not have its own currency, and so it suffered 10 times more.
Yes.
So that sort of thing too.
How would you view the possible impact of cryptocurrencies on the world financial and banking system? What does this mean for it?
The world financial system has, in one sense, gravitated towards this, recognizing that there are some merits. But at the same time, traditional finance power, which has become more monopolistic with time, they acquire each other and they become huge behemoths. They are also doing stuff that is in their interest rather than in the people's interest. So what they do is, for example, some progressive, you can say, or forward-looking institutions will offer some, let's say, exchange-traded fund marked by cryptocurrency. There are ETFs, exchange-traded funds like that. Or they may offer storage for this. So the wallet may actually be owned by a financial institution. Some even invest using this. These are the progressive types. And then there are the old-school ones that mark the dangers. Many prominent CEOs you find on Wall Street are not sympathetic, firstly because they're from a different generation. They might have started their careers in the late 70s, early 80s, far before this stuff came about. And so they may be hostile just because they're not up to date, but also they may recognize the concerns that we have discussed, and they caution the government not to be so keen on this. You will see the full spectrum of responses.
So in the next 10, 20 years, what are the emerging trends regarding cryptocurrencies that you can identify?
The first that I can identify is greater adoption of this, because you will have a generation, which we call Generation Alpha, come of age 20 years from now, and they will have grown up in a world that already knew cryptocurrencies. Even their parents would have invested. So the reticence towards a novel technology will no longer exist. The second is that I see tougher regulation on the piping of cryptocurrencies. What I mean by piping is that there are merits of trustlessness in the technology itself, but still there is a human factor involved. For example, the exchanges, they may be crooks, they may be launderers, etc. The piping will get tougher, so you will see the strongest and the most honest big players in the piping, in the machinery of it, survive. The intermediaries, the best ones, will survive. So you will see much more consolidation. You'll see much less gimmickry than you have seen in the last 10 years, for example. You may know of a case called FTX. That sort of thing is much less likely to happen. And third is you might see clearer rules about this kind of stuff at an international level. At present, you have some agencies which are dubious anyway, such as FATF. We all in Pakistan know this one well. They have worked on rules for cryptocurrencies, but not everybody accepts them or agrees with them. They seem a little bit ridiculous in some areas. So you will have much more clarity 20 years down the road. And so you will have a decentralized financial system working in tandem with what states will have as a legacy of 200 years in parallel 20 years from now.
So can you identify some particular sectors which are particularly interested in investing and benefiting from cryptocurrencies in contrast to others?
Yes, there are plenty. But first of all, in terms of industry, we look at people who need certain requirements. For example, there are some countries in crisis, such as Venezuela, and they have a migrant movement outwards, desperate people. It actually helps them to use cryptocurrency to pass it to their final destination and then use it there, because it's done digitally. So that's one area where I see that there's a strong requirement. The other that I see, which is very interesting, is in the development of financial markets. So there are players who want to muster some political support, some more attention of society towards these things. So for example, decentralized autonomous organizations, they pool together capital and invest in projects without anybody knowing anybody. They just follow a contract, a smart contract to do it. These types of, I think, are the most prominent use cases. In many other instances, there are partial use cases, but often one can easily provide an argument for using something that already existed in lieu of this. So for example, in mining or agriculture or space, you can make strong cases for cryptocurrency, but someone will make an equally strong case for sticking to the old program. They work equally well at best.
So my last question, Dr. Chohan, is that how do you see the public interest or state concern in Pakistan towards cryptocurrencies?
The estimate we have is that 4.1% of Pakistanis, and these are not clear because we don't always know the owners of wallets, so it's at best an estimate, but the estimate that I've come across by a company called AAA is that they have 4.1% ownership of cryptocurrencies in Pakistan, which is actually less than the world average, which is a reflection of a large population and one that actually doesn't have financial inclusion traditionally either. But the world average is about 7% now, and it can be micro wallets, it can be tiny amounts. That's why it's so large. And the interest in Pakistan has been because of the weakness of our currency. And yet, when you hear comments about cryptocurrency, you hear them in an ad hoc manner. Previous politicians, a few, have said that we're going to ban this immediately, which doesn't make sense because if you want to do that, you better have a strong rupee. You have to give your people some reasonable alternatives, otherwise they will find their own ways to survive. There's only so many dollars they can hoard in their mattresses here. There's only so much they can put in the bank. There's only so much that they can use. So cryptocurrencies for the younger generation, and we are a youthful country. Both of us are very old men compared to the median age now. And these people are far more attuned to this. As financial inclusion faces limitations in Pakistan in traditional mechanisms, this becomes even more promising with time. So I foresee that Pakistan will be at the vanguard of this going forward, especially as they feel the global currents are much more relaxed about this than they were in the past 15 years.
Dr. Chohan, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your very insightful and candid perspective on a very interesting subject, which invokes a lot of interest but confusion as well. And thank you for making us understand this various aspects of this cryptocurrencies in greater clarity and depth. Thank you so much.
Thank you.